Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and welcome to Writing on Games. Deus Ex Mankind Divided is a game whose narrative faces a real identity crisis on almost every level. It's at once a game that pushes itself as fiercely political, yet on the surface seems to have very little to actually say regarding the issues it so fervently co-opts. It continues the Deus Ex tradition of taking real-world issues to their perhaps logical, perhaps illogical conclusions, but its methods to make this feel real paradoxically make it feel less futuristic than the game that preceded it. One could reasonably expect many things from a Deus Ex game, but I don't think anyone could have expected something this safe. Mankind Divided seems to put many bold ideas out there, but can't actually bring itself to do anything bold with them. At least that's the case for the game's main story anyway. It's a jagged mess of a narrative that starts off trying less to make any kind of point about the real life issues and movements it's appropriating, and more just says, Augs might be good or might be bad, and then slowly gives way to a more expected Deus Ex staple of Illuminati conspiracies and such. The problem is that not only do the quite literal references to the Illuminati seem more and more absurd the further away we get from the Matrix, but because by the time the game clumsily drops the non-story it's trying to tell about racism and tries to focus on the bigger conspiracies, it has become too late to resolve either in any kind of satisfactory way, or even to make any semblance of a point about either. Especially towards the latter parts of the game, Adam feels like he's constantly trying to catch up to events out with his, and therefore the player's, control, and this is partly due to the fact that Adam's allegiances are never made particularly clear to the player. The player rarely feels like they can change anything in this game because they never really stick with one group of people long enough to affect that change. And the ending sequel bait, not quite cliffhanger nature, only serves to solidify this. It really is a mess and reeks of the writers sensing the controversy surrounding the whole Augs Lives Matter thing in the marketing and really backing off for fear of angering any part of the community. As a result, it can truly say nothing meaningful. Perhaps worse though, it doesn't give the player the chance to say anything meaningful either. Cutscenes that would usually be rife with dialogue choices are now replaced with terrible pre-rendered fare that looks so disjointed from the in-engine stuff, which by the way looks far better, that it's confusing on both a mechanical and aesthetic level that they lean so heavily on this completely static method of storytelling. With all of this in mind though, it becomes particularly baffling that nearly every criticism I have of the main story is nearly perfectly remedied in the side missions. Whilst the main story feels like it's treating the player like a baby and capable of making their own decisions, the side missions truly respect the player's intelligence, and it's a welcome change. These side missions are where I would argue the real game is. The main story missions suffer from the problem I have with the way, for example, missions in the Phantom Pain play out. There are multiple tools at your disposal, but every mission essentially comes down to you start in one place and you've got to get to the other place or get the thing from the other place. There are many ways in which you can get from one place to the other, for example, but that core loop never really changes. In the side missions though, everything seems far more nuanced. Whilst I felt the main missions had me stealthing about as a thief or a trespasser and not much else, the side missions often made me feel more like a detective, for example. Trying to find the source of Adam's new Augs, pretending to be someone else in order to extract intelligence from a shady informant, collecting evidence from crime scenes and deciding the fate of a suspect. These are just some examples of the more sleuth-esque work Jensen does in these side missions. They play into the more campy, noir-esque elements of the setting and narrative, and as such the inherent absurdity of a gruff, blank slate of a man like Jensen waxing philosophical becomes a lot easier to swallow. They offer more variety in terms of gameplay for sure, but more importantly I feel, they take advantage of the game's world and setting in some really compelling ways. What I mean by this is that whilst the main story feels so much bigger and messier than the setting of Prague it predominantly takes place in, the side missions use their smaller scale as a means to frame their stories against the backdrop of Prague and everything that's going on within it. The main story shows the people affected by its larger globe-spanning implications, but that's all it really does, it just shows them. What the side missions allow the player to do is explore the lifestyles of the different denizens of this world in more depth, getting interesting stories that might not resolve to any world-altering event, but give the player a better idea of how this world works for different groups of people. You explore the inner workings of the different factions of mobsters who are continuing their criminality despite the witch hunt for augmented people. You see how businesses work in this police state, and also, weirdly, explore more deeply the themes of racism and police militarization the main story makes gestures towards, but quickly drops without saying much of anything about it. Not only this, but by reducing the scale of a mission initially, the game can then make a more significant point about the world more effectively later on. Or I should say, the game then allows the player to make that point themselves, which is far more effective. A specific example of this I would point to is the side mission The Harvester, and I'll try not to go into too much spoilery detail here for those who haven't played it, but proceed with caution. In which a serial killer has been ripping augmented women apart in a particularly grisly fashion. Here we see Jensen dealing with an individual witness, an individual so-called scandalmonger, and an individual police chief, jaded by years of bureaucracy and corruption. The mission's story not only goes into more depth about the way police are militarised in the world of Mankind Divided, how augmented people are second-class citizens, and how Jensen's experience as a cop affects his relationships with the police, but also sees the player making a very important choice. This mission can just end with very little in the way of closure. In making the player a participant in going down this route, it hammers home a wider point about the subversion of the act of merely telling the truth, in a world whose media aims to keep its public scared and loyal to the agenda. Again, I won't go into spoilers here, but it takes that initially tacky "wake up sheeple, Fox News is biased" angle hammered home by the news broadcasts on TV, and turns it into a more meta point about how we as a people crave closure in our narratives, even if that means that we aren't getting the whole story. The world of Mankind Divided constantly assures its public that there's always a suspect, always a reason, an agenda, there's always closure. What this and a great deal of the other side missions do in this game is force the player to confront the idea that when the truth is involved, these things are almost never a given. Now, for all the game's allusions to the masses rising up against corrupt governments and smashing the state, perhaps the most meaningful and subversive statements the game makes are those that the player makes as an individual to an individual. It's an old staple on this channel, I know, but as always, by trying to tell a story of cataclysmic scale, you end up being able to say nothing of note at all due to a lack of focus. By reducing the scale of your narrative, by more carefully managing your start and end point, and only featuring the characters most necessary to make your point, you can end up making a wider, more significant statement about the world those characters inhabit, and indeed, perhaps, the real world. I guess at the end of the day, what I'm saying is that when you're playing Mankind Divided, don't skip the side missions. They're one of the few points at which this game is really allowed to shine. So there you have it, my thoughts on how the main story of Mankind Divided, in terms of its narrative, absolutely pales in comparison to its side missions. I might return to Mankind Divided at some point to focus more on nuts and bolts gameplay, but I feel that the narrative comparison between main and side missions represents a philosophy that carries over into the gameplay between the two. Ultimately, it's an enjoyable experience, but one which needed far more careful execution. And with all that said, I'd just like to sincerely thank my patrons, whose names should be on the screen now, who truly make this show possible and have helped me out enormously, both financially and personally. If you would like to see your name at the end of a video or get the scripts and soundtracks to the episodes, I for one am particularly proud of this UNATCO theme cover, if you would consider pledging, it would mean the absolute world to me. As always, I'm Hamish Black and this has been Writing on Games. Thank you very much for watching and I'll see you next time.